Chapter 1. Whispers in the Trees. The sun filtered through the high boughs of mirthwood like golden dust swirling in silence. Shafts of light pierced the thick canopy above, catching on the motes of pollen that drifted lazily through the air. Birdsong had fallen quiet, too quiet for midday. Only the distant, mournful rustle of leaves remained, whispering with urgency, as though the trees themselves were trying to speak. And Venrillis moved like a shadow between trunks older than empires. Cloaked in forest weave and draped in the mossy greens of his kind, he seemed a part of the woodland, more spirit than elf. His bow, carved from the sacred soulwood of Eldshade Grove, rested on his back, but his long, slender fingers remained ever close to the hilt of his curved hunting blade. The trees around him were silent sentinels, his only companions, and his only judges. He was not merely a wanderer of the woods. He was a merchant, an honored custodian of ancient relics and knowledge, trading not in coin but in secrets, enchantments, and memory. Venrillis had walked these woods for centuries, his mind a vault of forgotten lore, his heart forever tethered to the pulse of the forest. But today he felt the rhythm faltering. He stood before the entrance to the Sulvolt, an alcove hidden beneath the roots of a petrified oak known as Drelthir, the Iron Sentinel. Its bark was gnarled and fossil-like, bark harder than stone, branches bare as bones reaching toward the sky. Beneath its base, veiled behind an illusion of thorns and ivy, the vault door had stood sealed for over 50 years. Until now, Venrillis's breath caught. The protective sigils carved in spiraling runes had been shattered, broken not with force but by corruption. The magic had not failed, it had been unraveled. Something foul had gnawed at the wards like a rat chewing through a web of gossamer. The air reeked of musk and warp oil, a scent that didn't belong in the natural order. The elf knelt, brushing his fingers across the disturbed soil. Claw marks, sharp, uneven. Not feline, these were too numerous, too crude. He narrowed his eyes and leaned in. Gray fur, scattered droppings, a single jagged tooth half buried in the dirt. Skaven, filthy, treacherous ratman. He hissed, a whisper like a breeze through dry leaves. He stepped into the vault. What greeted him was not the silence of a desecrated tomb, but the echo of mockery. The once orderly chamber, lit by glowing crystal fungus and etched with elder glyphs, was now a ransacked hollow of shattered glass, splintered wood, and smeared blood. A warden sprite, one of the tiny sylvan guardians, lay impaled on a shard of enchanted glass, its glowing wings twitching in death throes, the light fading from its fractured form. Venrillis approached slowly, kneeling before the defiled heart of the vault. The soulwood casket, the centerpiece, was gone. Not broken. Taken. His breath turned ragged. That casket had housed the seeds of Shaladrin, saplings from the first tree, imbued with memories of the old world, living memories that sang through the roots of Mirthwood itself. In the wrong hands, they could become tools of devastation or perverse experimentation. And there was no hand more wrong than that of a Skaven warlock. Something cracked behind him. Venrillis turned in a blur. A shape darted from the shadows, small, hunched, twitching with unnatural spasms. Its fur was patchy and stank of oil and decay, and its rust-colored eyes gleamed with sickly hunger. He didn't hesitate. With one fluid motion he unsheathed his blade and lunged. The dagger slipped between the Skaven's ribs with a crunch of bone and a wet squelch of punctured lung. The rat thing shrieked, a high-pitched, rattling wail as it clawed frantically at him, blood spraying in thick, dark gouts. Venrillis twisted the blade, and the creature spasmed, its screams cut short as its throat gurgled closed. But before it collapsed, its clawed hand extended, and it grinned. A rune burned into its chest, flared green. Arp sigil. Enrillis had barely a second before the corpse exploded, a shockwave of sickly green flame lashing out like a serpent's tongue. He threw himself back, shielding his face. Bark and rock splintered. The shockwave tore chunks from the vault walls, toppling ancient relics and shattering centuries-old shelves. Smoke coiled, acrid and laced with death. Enrillis coughed, rising from the rubble, his skin scorched and bleeding, cloak torn. The light from the crystal fungi flickered and dimmed, as if mourning. He staggered out into the open, the air outside fresher, but still wrong. The trees moaned in pain. The corruption had already begun to spread, and with it came war. Chapter 2. Tracks in the Dirt. The dawn broke like a wound across the horizon, bleeding red light through the mist-shrouded forest. Mirthwood, normally a sanctuary of harmony and ageless quiet, had become a realm of uneasy breathing. The wind no longer danced among the branches. It crawled, whispering warnings from tree to tree, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Enrillis moved with grim purpose. His body ached from the explosion, burned flesh beneath torn armor, cuts crusted with dried blood, but pain was nothing new. Pain was just another part of the forest, like thorns on a rose vine. It taught, it warned, and today it screamed. He stood at the edge of the Sulvo glade, eyes narrowing at the chaos splayed across the once sacred earth. The detonation had scorched a circle of blackened soil into the clearing, killing the surrounding underbrush. Trees leaned away from the blight, their bark cracking and weeping amber resin like tears from ancient sentinels. But amidst the destruction, Enrillis found what he sought. Tracks. Tiny, clawed, frantic, Skaven feet, hundreds, maybe more. They hadn't come alone, not for a relic this powerful. He followed them. The trail wove through thickets and shallow glades, cutting across mossy banks and weaving between trees that grew tighter together, as if trying to close off the path behind them. The marks in the dirt, disturbed leaves, broken roots, spatterings of droppings, all told the tale of a chaotic retreat. Skaven were never silent, even when they wanted to be, and this warband had fled with haste. At midday he found the first corpse. It hung suspended from a snare vine, a rare semi-sentient plant known for reacting to blood scent. The Ratman had likely bled on it in passing. Now it dangled from the trees, impaled by thorny tendrils that had sprouted through its ribcage and jaw. Its eyes had been sucked dry. The body twitched every now and then as the vine fed. Enrillis watched in silence. He made no move to help. There was no mercy in Mirthwood for defilers. Further down the trail, the woods grew stranger. The soil darkened, turning damp and thick, squelching underfoot with a stench of rot. Warp taint. Subtle at first, like ozone before a storm, but building. Here and there the leaves bore black speckles, as if diseased. Mushrooms glowed faintly with an unnatural hue, and moss pulsed when touched. Then he heard them. Skitters. Chittering voices, metal scraping on stone. Enrillis dropped low, moving with the practiced grace of a hunter born from silence. He crept through the underbrush until the trees opened into a hollow. A squad of Skaven clustered around a crude cart made of bone and rusted iron, pulled by two blind, mutated Radagers. Upon the cart sat a casket, a wooden shape engraved with glyphs now cracked and pulsing with sickly green light. The seeds of Shaladrin. One of the Skaven, likely a packmaster by its studded whip and elaborate rusted helm, was barking orders, teeth gnashing between snarled commands. Another stood nearby, cloaked in warped brass and adorned with strange, whirring devices, an apprentice warlock engineer, no doubt. Enrillis watched, rage like wildfire building behind his ribs. He knew he should wait, call for aid. But the sight of the seeds, their bark weeping sap, the roots twitching with corruption, stole his reason. He rose and drew his bow. The first arrow took the Packmaster through the neck, splintering bone and tearing the flesh with a wet crack. The creature staggered backward, gurgling, blood spraying from its maw like a burst wineskin, before it collapsed, twitching, into the mud. The second arrow pierced the engineer's eye, punching through the lens of its arcane goggles and lodging deep in its skull. The body spasmed, metal limbs jerking wildly, as the warp battery it carried discharged in a flash of green light. The wraiths screamed, squealing, panic-driven cries that echoed through the trees. Venrilis leapt from the foliage, landing on a Skaven that barely had time to look up before his dagger sank deep into its chest. He ripped it free with a twist that opened the Ratman's torso like a gutted boar. Entrails spilled across the forest floor in steaming ropes. Another came at him, spear raised. He sidestepped, caught the shaft mid-lunge and wrenched it sideways, snapping the wood and using the jagged end to impale the Skaven through the throat. It dropped with a strangled shriek, blood bubbling up around the spike as it kicked in the underbrush. But numbers swarmed. 3, 5, 9. Claws raking, blades slashing. One struck him across the back, tearing cloth and flesh alike. Another bit into his thigh. He snarled, spinning in a dance of steel, his curved blade flashing under the greenlit canopy. He killed effortlessly, elegantly. Blood fountained from severed arteries. Heads rolled in the dirt. One Ratman tried to flee. Venrilis hurled a dagger into its spine, watching it collapse mid-sprint, squealing as its legs stopped working. Breath-heaving, chest soaked in sweat and blood, his and theirs, Venrilis stood alone. The clearing was silent again, save for the buzzing of flies already descending. The casket, still on the cart. He approached, hands trembling. The runes on its surface pulsed unnaturally, twisted now, speaking not of memory and renewal, but of mutation. One seedling had split open, its roots writhing like veins, feeding off the green glow. Venrilis knelt and touched it, his fingers brushing warped bark. The forest memory screamed. He pulled back, breath shuddering. This was no longer a matter of theft. This was a desecration. A curse. And the Skaven were only beginning. Chapter 3. Council of Leaves. Twilight bled into the forest like a bruise, the sky overhead deepening to a dusky purple as night closed its jaws around Mirthwood. In the dwindling light, the trees whispered with voices older than kings. Venrilis moved between them, his cloak tattered and stained with the dried blood of Skaven. Every step felt heavier. The forest pressed in around him, less a sanctuary now, and more a sickened beast twisting in discomfort. He walked the path to Ealdamar, the Heartglade, where the Council of Leaves held their vigils. As he drew near, the air shimmered with ancient enchantments. Ward spells whispered warnings in the old tongue, sifting through his essence, judging his worth, probing for corruption. He allowed them. They had to know the truth. At the glade's edge, 4 great trees stood in perfect symmetry, each one housing a living elder within. Not wooden effigies, not thrones, but living, breathing melds of flesh and bark, grown into the trees by choice, their roots woven with the forest itself. This was the Gladewatch Council, keepers of balance, arbiters of all disputes beyond the reach of solitary clans. As Vendruli stepped into the sacred ring, light from the moon bathed the glade in silver. Fireflies swirled in choreographed silence. The leaves rustled not with the wind, but with awareness. Venrilis of the hollowed grove. Came the voice of Eldatheniel, whose bark-fused face emerged from the largest tree, his features like chiseled oak, eyes glowing with quiet wisdom. You enter wounded, marked by battle. Speak, and let the forest bear witness." Venrilus knelt on one knee, placing the blood-soaked casket, now sealed in binding vines, before them. "The Sulvolts has been breached," he began, voice low and hard. "The seeds of Shaladrin are stolen, twisted by Skaven hands. One was feeding on Warpstone." A ripple moved through the trees. "The Skaven have dared invade Mirthwood," snarled Elder Orlintha, her voice rough as splintered bark, her form more gnarled than the others, riddled with thorned limbs and darkened scars. "And they still draw breath." "They fled underground," Vendrillis answered. "Warp machines, tainted beasts, they've broken our wards, and I believe they've only just begun." Elder Andrel shifted in his tree throne, a melancholy sigh echoing like wind through hollow logs. "To take up arms again. The forest has not forgotten the last war. It barely survived, and it will not survive this if we do nothing," Venrilus snapped. "The taint is spreading already, I saw it. Mushrooms glowing where they should not, trees blackened from the inside. They mean to turn Mirthwood into a laboratory of rot." "Why would they risk open war?" murmured Thaniel. "Skaven do not act without cowardice to guide them." "Because they've found something worth dying for," Vendrillis said. "They know the value of the seeds, and I suspect one of their warlocks believes he can use them to grow something new, some horror born of both root and warp." The glade fell still. Venrillis rose to his feet. "I slew a dozen in the dark. Blood runs thick along their trail. But there will be more. We must act, strike before they can anchor themselves. Call the Way Watchers, wake the tree herds. This is not a mere theft. This is war." Erlintha grunted, bark cracking as her limbs twitched. "You've always been brash, Venrillis. Impetuous, even for one of your line." He stepped closer, letting the glade's soft light illuminate his face, blood-smeared, drawn with exhaustion and fury. "Then call me what I am, but do not call me blind. If we wait, the forest dies, and you know what comes after." They did not respond immediately. Instead, the trees answered. A tremor passed through the roots. Leaves shivered. From the earth rose shapes, slender dryads with eyes like amber fireflies, silent treekin with bark-armored limbs like battering rams, and the ethereal presence of wisps, dancing in solemn silence. The forest itself had listened, and it had chosen. Elder Thaniel finally nodded. "You will have watchers, scouts, aid where it can be spared. But we do not march to war on your word alone. Bring us the source, find this warlock, this defiler, show us his intent. Then we shall see." Venrillis bowed stiffly, swallowing the scream in his chest. He turned, and as he stepped into the darkness once more, the fireflies faded behind him. But the forest did not return to stillness. From far beyond the glade, somewhere beneath the earth, a low metallic hum began to rise, growing louder with each passing moment. And below the roots of Mirth was a warlock laughed. Chapter 4. Through Poisoned Tunnels. The earth groaned. Beneath the forest's vast whispering canopy, far from the shimmering glades and moon-kissed thickets of Mirthwood, Venrillis descended into shadow. He stood at the mouth of an ancient tunnel, a forgotten wound in the forest floor, its maw ringed with stones blackened by soot and time, overgrown with strangler vines and creeping moss. The dwarves had carved this place millennia ago, when stones still bowed to their pride and axes rang like thunder in the deeps. But now it reeked of something far older, far fouler. Warp stink. Venrillis drew a cloth soaked in bitter tree sap across his face. Even that did little to dull the stench, a sickening blend of metal, musk and rot. The tunnel breathed like a diseased lung, its stale air whispering of vermin dreams and screaming machines. Clutching his soulwood blade, he slipped inside. Darkness swallowed him whole. The stone corridor spiraled downward like a serpent, lined with the faded carvings of old dwarf victories, battles frozen in time, now defaced with claw marks and crude Skaven glyphs scrawled in what looked like blood and bile. Broken bones littered the edges, gnawed and splintered, their marrow long since sucked dry. He moved with the silence of falling snow, footsteps barely whispering over the cracked stone. His elven senses strained forward, catching the vibration of voices, sharp, nasally chittering. Skaven speech. One voice commanded, others obeyed with frantic squeaks. He crouched at a jagged alcove and peered into a chamber lit by flickering warp flames. The walls shimmered with fungus and pipes, cobbled together from stolen scrap. In the center, hunched over a console of brass and bone, was a Skaven warlock. Its robe was stitched from flayed rat hide, reinforced with copper tubing that fed into its bloated spine. A green lens covered one eye, whirring as it adjusted. Sparks danced at its fingertips as it poked and prodded at a mass of pulsating wood. It had grown grotesque, no longer a sapling, but something new, something wrong. Its roots had become tendrils, twitching as if in pain or hunger. Its bark glowed with green veins of warp energy. Even from this distance, Vanillus could feel its pulse, an abomination's heartbeat, echoing through stone and soil. He drew an arrow, took aim. Then something screeched. A sentry Skaven, perched in the tunnel above, spotted him. It shrieked, claws scraping the stone, its voice piercing like a blade drawn across glass. Venrillis fired. The arrow punched through the creature's open mouth and out the back of its skull, brains spraying against the tunnel wall in a hot pink smear. But the damage was done. The chamber exploded into chaos. The warlock shrieked in alarm, triggering an arcane lever. Metal plates slammed over the seed, locking it in a protective cage. Warp sparks flared as defense turrets unfolded from the walls. Gutter cannons and jagged spear launchers aimed at the entrance. Vendrilus rolled forward as a bolt of warp lightning hissed past his ear and disintegrated a stalagmite behind him. He ducked into cover behind a rusted dwarven statue as spear bolts clattered off stone around him. 3 Skaven charged him with jagged blades, foam frothing at their crooked teeth. He emerged from cover in a blur, blade flashing. The first rat fell with its throat opened, a red gash blooming across its neck like a perverse flower. The second he drove back with a kick to the gut, then pivoted and embedded his blade in the third's belly, twisting until entrails slopped free onto the floor with a wet slap. The second lunged again, only to be caught mid-air by a jagged trap vine summoned from Venrillus's gauntlet. It pierced through the rat's eye, dragging it into the ceiling where it flailed, shrieking, before being ripped in half. The warlock screamed in rage. Kill/him. Feed him to the cage root, it shrieked, sparks flying from its mouth. No more stealing, spying. Venrillis advanced. The air was thick with smoke and blood. He loosed an arrow into the nearest turret. It exploded in a burst of green flame, igniting a nearby Skaen who flailed, burning, as its fur melted from its bones. Another lunged at him from behind, but he spun, grabbing its muzzle and slamming its head into the stone until its skull caved in, spraying his face with blood and teeth. He reached the cage. The seed inside throbbed, sensing him. The bark split slightly, revealing an eye, not a knot, not bark, but an actual organic eye. It blinked once. Then again. Andrillis felt bile rise in his throat. He turned to the warlock. Their eyes locked. It raised a claw, channeling another blast of warp lightning. But Venrillis was faster. He hurled a blade, not at the warlock, but at the ceiling above it. The impact triggered a partial collapse. Stone and steel crashed down, burying the rat engineer in rubble with a scream that dissolved into a sickening crunch. Silence fell. Only the pulse of the caged seed remained. Slow, deep, corrupted. Venrilis stood amidst the dead, chest heaving, body shaking. He had seen enough. This was no theft. It was an experiment. And the Skaven were just getting started. Chapter 5. Skittering Shadows. The deeper Venrilis descended into the underworld of stone and filth, the more the air changed. It was no longer just foul. It clung to him, a living thing, thick with musk and madness. Every breath tasted of rusted iron and rotted meat. Every surface pulsed with a greasy dampness, as though the tunnels themselves were sweating disease. The ruins of the Skaven chamber still smoldered behind him. The mutant seed had been sealed back within a tangle of roots and iron, but its image haunted him. The blink of that singular eye, watching him from within warped wood, twitching like a thought trying to break free. Now he stalked the next corridor, deeper still. Ahead lay another chamber, lit by a grotesque green glow. From his vantage, Venrilis could see the beginnings of something vast, an underground Skaven staging ground, a nest of movement, hissing, and purpose. He lowered to one knee, eyes narrowing. Dozens of Skaven swarmed the forge pits below. The air was filled with the clang-clang of blacksmiths hammering on warp-tainted metal, the crackle of electric conduits surging with unstable energy, and the squeal of rat-men dragging slaves, humans, dwarfs, even a beastman bound in shackles and forced to labor under threat of lash or blade. Cages lined the walls. Screams echoed from within. And at the center stood him, Narks, Skitterfang. Even among Skaven he was grotesque, hunched and massive, his robes bristled with copper rods and stitched warp cabling. His flesh had been replaced in patches with armor-plated bone and warped steel. One eye was an orb of green glass, the other swollen shut. His tail dragged a serrated blade across the floor with every step, screeching against the stone. Venrilis's jaw clenched. This was no mere warlock engineer. This was a visionary of corruption. Narks bellowed orders in screech-speak, his claws punctuating each command with manic jerks. Or take wood thing pieces. Attach, fuse, grow. Yes, yes. Venrilis crept closer along a scaffolding, taking careful note of every bolt-thrower, every warp cannon, every Skaven engineer armed with volatile tech. This was an army in the making. He had to move. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. Plank snapped underfoot. Silence followed. Dozens of Skaven heads turned. Yellow eyes blinked. Nostrils flared. Then, stake nothing, sniff him, kill Lauder. The nest exploded. Venrilis sprinted, leaping from the walkway just as it collapsed under a storm of bolts and shrapnel. He hit the ground in a roll, coming up beneath a warp forge. Sparks showered him as a skein lunged with a power saw. Venrilis ducked and buried his dagger in its gut, twisting and pulling upward, spilling steaming organs onto the forge plate. Tunnel leapt from above. Venrilis snatched a fallen warblade and split the ratman from chin to skull in one brutal upward slash. Bone cracked, brain sprayed, the corpse twitched in half. Then they came in waves. Claws, screeches, snarls, dozens of them. He moved through them like a storm. His blade flashed with each breath, one to the throat, another through the eye, a third jammed up under a ribcage. Blood painted the floor in arcs, limbs scattering like broken toys. A rat ogre barreled toward him, its jaw wired shut and eyes bulging with rage. Venrilis sprinted straight at it. At the last second he dove under its swing, rolling between its legs and slashing its hamstrings. The beast bellowed, crashing forward. Before it could rise, Venrilis climbed its spine and drove 2 short blades into its skull with all his weight, crack, crack, twisting until the ogre collapsed in a death spasm that shook the chamber. From the far platform, Narx shrieked in rage, raising a glowing staff. Burn fry him now. Warp lightning arced. Venrilis vaulted over an anvil just as the bolt struck, the impact vaporizing a pair of nearby Skaven in a blinding blast. One of their heads rolled past him, eyes still blinking. He fired 3 arrows in rapid succession, one embedded in a warp-lock generator, triggering a boom that showered the room in molten brass. Screams filled the air. Another hit a banner pole, collapsing part of a scaffold and crushing a squad of albino storm vermin. The 3rd arrow, barbed, enchanted, sank into Narx's shoulder. The warlock howled, falling back with a hiss, clawing at the shaft now crackling with binding roots. But it was too late. He had activated a wargate. The portal shrieked open in mid-air, sucking him in with a flash of green. And he was gone. The remaining Skaven wailed in panic, scurrying to flee, but Venrilis wasn't done. He hurled a vial of soul flame, sacred fire drawn from the heart of Mirthwood, into the core of their forge. It ignited on contact, golden flames devouring the warp machinery in an instant. The fire screamed as it fed. Explosions tore through the cavern. The heat was unbearable, stone cracked, steel twisted. Slaves fled in all directions, shackles still clanging. Venrilis ran. Behind him, the Skaven forge collapsed, swallowed by sacred fire. He didn't stop until the tunnel narrowed and the heat vanished. He leaned against the stone, chest heaving. Narx had escaped, but not unharmed. And now Venrilis had a name, a face, and the first true taste of war. Chapter 6. The Rotten Forge. Deep beneath the corrupted belly of Mirthwood, in a vast hollow carved not by nature, but by claw, greed, and madness, the forge of Narx Skitterfang thrummed with new life. The chamber pulsed like a tumor, a colossal sphere of metal and stone laced with glowing veins of warpstone, festering in the dark like a heart gone black. Here, beneath the roots of the world, the future was being forged, one stitch of bone and warp fire at a time. Warp steam hissed through twisted pipes overhead, the air thick with vapor and soot. Massive gears turned with a teeth-grinding shriek, each rotation coughing out more sparks, more heat. Slaves shuffled in miserable lines, dragging slag, pouring molten ore into molds shaped like spiked vertebrae and unnatural growths. The air was filled with a constant hum, a maddening resonance that seemed to claw at the inside of the skull. And at the center of it all was him. Narx Skitterfang, scarred, seething, now bound in fresh bandages, soaked with healing paste, and blood loomed over his engineers like a god thing reborn. The arrow wound still throbbed in his shoulder, the roots having burrowed deep before being torn out. The pain sharpened him, made his thoughts louder. He wore it like a crown. His back heaved with twitching tubes. His one good eye gleamed with vicious genius. He stood upon a platform suspended by chains, glaring down at the latest experiment. The seed of Shaladrin, his prize, was no longer merely mutating. It was awakening. It sat within a vat of warp fluid, its bark pulsing with energy, roots sprawling out like veins beneath the glass. But now, from its gnarled body, twisted limbs began to grow. Not branches. Arms. The beginnings of something shaped like a mockery of man and tree alike. Its eye opened again, wider, more alert. It was learning. Narx spread his arms and shrieked with glee. Yes, yes, awake, grow, little root beast. Feel, pull, warp, hunger. Learn, think, obey. His assistants, a clutch of lesser engineers with rusted bone augmetics and rag-stitched robes, scrambled to record notes, scratch diagrams, or simply stay out of reach. One moved too slow. Narx turned. In a flash, he ripped the brass coil from the assistant's back, snapping the spine in half. The Ratman dropped, twitching and bleeding. Narks hurled the corpse into the seed vat. The roots of the creature lashed forward and impaled the body. It drained the flesh in seconds, leaving only a hollow skin and bones that cracked like dried twigs. The forge workers fell silent. "See!" Narks cackled, voice shrill with ecstasy. "It feeds! No more grow plant! Now it hunts, kills, it learns like me!" He staggered down the steps, sparks trailing his warped footfalls, dragging his blade tail behind him. He moved toward the central forge altar, where a cluster of other soulwood fragments had been fused into experimental armor plating and limb grafts. These were not like the seed. These were weapons, shields of living bark that hissed when touched, blades that twitched with anticipation, helms that whispered unintelligible words when worn. In one corner, a prototype rat ogre stood half-assembled, its exposed ribs interwoven with root and iron. A distended bulb grew from its shoulder, a secondary brain, pulsing with an independent rhythm. It growled as engineers jabbed wires into its spine, testing reflexes. It snapped a Skaven clean in half when the pain surged too high. Narks didn't stop them. "Pain good, yes," he crooned. "Means it feels. Feels means obeys. Learns more faster now." At the far end of the forge, new warpfire cannonades were being assembled with grotesque integration. Parts of the soulwood melted into the barrels. Each one bore a gaping, screaming mouth at its muzzle, and when tested, they didn't shoot flames, they howled them, a shriek of agony riding the infernal blast. But something was missing. Narks turned to his second-in-command, a one-eyed engineer with half a jaw missing, covered in pustules. Still no tree-thing elf? The leaf thief, whereas finds him. The engineer shook his head rapidly, stammering. "No find, master. Scouts dead, yes, all. Vanished. Many say forest eats them now." Narks snarled. His mechanical tail lashed and severed the Ratman's head from his shoulders. The body spasmed and dropped with a wet splatter. No screams, just a hiss of steam as blood pooled across the stone. The other engineers flinched. Narks wiped his claws on his robe, gaze burning. Fine. Let the forest think hide him. But soon, no place to hide. He turned to the seed vat and laid a claw upon the glass. The creature twitched. Its eye rolled toward him. A single jagged limb reached for the edge of its containment like a child reaching for its mother's face. "I grow army. I raise weapons." Soon, roots tear trees down, soil bleed green, no forest, no elf, only Skaven wood now. His laughter echoed off stone and steel, and far above, the roots of Mirthwood quivered. Chapter 7. Blightroot Unbound. Mirthwood wept. Its leaves no longer danced in the breeze. They hung limp, browning at the edges, their once lush vibrance drained like life-blood. The canopy, once a cathedral of life, now trembled with invisible sickness. The roots below, those sacred veins that pulsed memory, magic, and song, twitched in silent agony. Venrilla stood atop the moss-covered rise of Drelther's Hollow, where 3 ancient heart trees had once intertwined, their roots forming a living altar to the forest spirits. Now, only one remained. The second had gone black, its bark cracked and bleeding pitch. The third had withered to a petrified husk. Leaves gone to dust, its spirit long fled. But it was what lay between them that made his breath freeze. The Blightroot, once merely a corrupted offshoot, rare and containable, it now stood fully formed. A towering abomination of twisted bark, iron and warp-tainted flesh. It writhed, as if struggling against the very concept of stillness. Rooted to the earth, yet never truly at rest, it groaned low and long, a sound like trees dying in slow motion. Then Relis crouched behind a ring of gnarled stone and watched. The thing was alive. Its bark bulged with eyes, dozens of them, all different sizes, shapes, all blinking independently. Some rolled wildly, others stared unblinking at the dying trees. Beneath its main trunk, if one could call it that, hung tendrils slick with warp mucus, dragging bones and metal fragments behind them like forgotten prey. Its crown was a halo of thorned branches, fused with severed heads and rotting organs from those who had tried to stop it. One of those heads was elven. The jawbone was missing, but the ears were unmistakable. Benrelis's knuckles whitened on the hilt of his blade. Below the abomination, Skaven danced, a mob of them no less than 30, chanting in screech speech, waving censers that belched green vapors. They sang with voices like rusted blades, a discordant rhythm of madness. Their shamans flailed rat skulls on chains, casting sparks of warp magic into the base of the Blightroot, feeding it. And it responded. Its tendrils surged into the ground, cracking the earth open. Roots shot out with explosive force, coiling around a nearby pine and crushing it with an ear-piercing crunch. Sap exploded in every direction. The pine's death scream, a sacred sound in Mirthwood, rattled the birds from miles away. Benrelis didn't wait. He rose from cover, nocked an arrow, and fired. The shaft sliced through the air like judgment and impaled one of the shamans through the throat. The Ratman dropped mid-chant, gargling as his windpipe sprayed blood like a ruptured pipe. Before the others could react, he loosed another arrow. It struck a censer, igniting it mid-air in a blaze of cursed smoke. The explosion engulfed 4 Skaven, who clawed at their own faces as their flesh boiled and fur crisped. Then he moved. Passed down the slope in a blur, blades drawn. He struck the rear ranks first, carving through them like a scythe. One head flew from its body and bounced down the hill. Another rat had its spine severed, its limbs twitching in death. Blood painted the moss red. The Skaven panicked, shrieking, some running into their own traps in the chaos. But the Blightroot awoke. He turned toward him. All eyes blinked at once. The air grew heavy, like gravity had doubled. A deep groan shook the ground, and its main trunk split open to reveal a maw, a vertical gash lined with jagged, flexing thorns. A roar, no, a scream tore from within. A voice not made to be heard by mortals. And Relis faltered, the noise pounding into his skull, his vision warping. He felt his memories slip. Names, faces, places, all blurred. His knees buckled. But he gritted his teeth, bit the inside of his cheek until blood welled, and forced himself back. He drew his twin blades and charged. The Blightroot struck. A tendril slammed into the earth beside him, tearing a trench 2 yards deep. He rolled under another, barely avoiding the barbed whip that came down with enough force to split a boulder. He reached its base and began to carve. His blades sang as they danced through its roots, slicing open bark that oozed green ichor. The Blightroot shrieked, flailing wildly. Another tendril slammed down and pierced his shoulder, impaling him to the ground. He screamed, but twisted his body sideways, slicing the root in half with a reversed grip. He wrenched free, trailing blood. Then he drew a rune blade. Forged from the heartwood of Eldshade, it pulsed with pure forest magic. With a scream of his own, Benrelis plunged the blade into the core of the Blightroot. It thrashed violently, eyes spinning, thorns flailing. The ratman, still alive, fled in terror. Warp energy poured from the wound like smoke from a volcano. The thing shuddered, a final desperate flailing of limbs and claws. Then, silence. The creature groaned low. and collapsed into itself. Its form crumbled, bark blackening, roots recoiling into the dirt. Within moments, all that remained was a crater of smoldering rot, the earth scorched and hissing. Benrylas collapsed beside it, blood soaking his cloak, shoulder mangled. He stared at the dying trees, at the torn canopy above, at the smoke that no longer rose. It was dead, but not alone. This was only the first. The forest would never be the same. Chapter 8. Allies of Ashen Bark. Dawn broke as a sickly smudge across the sky, its light strained through a canopy disfigured by death. Where once Mirthwood awakened in harmony, birds in chorus, leaves sighing in windsong, now it shuddered. The trees bore scars that would never heal. The grass grew in twisted spirals, fungus bloomed in colors that had no name. The forest was at war, even if the trees had no tongues to cry out. Benrylas stumbled through the undergrowth, clutching his mangled shoulder. Blood dripped from his fingers in slow, steady drops. The rune blade, still slick with Blightroot ichor, pulsed faintly on his back like a heartbeat. His breath came in ragged gasps. He'd walked nearly 10 miles since the battle, every step grinding bone against torn muscle. His body screamed for rest, but rest was no longer an option. He had seen the truth, felt it in his marrow. The Skaven were not just invading, they were cultivating. They were sowing rot. He needed allies, those bound not by politics or pride, but by earth and vengeance. He reached a ridge where the ash trees grew, black and ancient. Here, fire had once cleansed a vast swath of forest centuries ago. The bark still bore burn scars, but life had returned. Stronger, wiser, angrier. This was the domain of the Ashborn Dryads, spirits hardened by flame and forged in loss. Benrylas knelt, pressing his bloodied hand to the soil. He whispered the old words, Sylvanic invocations forbidden in the cities of elves, prayers to the first seeds, spoken in syllables older than time. The ground trembled, the air thickened, and then they came. They emerged from the trunks like shadows pulled from bark. 8 of them, tall, slender, bodies of wood and sinew, arms tipped with talons like broken glass. Their eyes glowed with emberlight, faces frozen in expressions that blended sorrow, rage, and hunger. One stepped forward, leaves falling from her shoulders like dead feathers. She was their Matreum, Vehala of the Charred Heart. Benrylas raised his eyes to her. Vengeance, he rasped. Her voice crackled like fire chewing through dry wood. And we seek meaning in blood. He bowed his head. The Skaven defile our roots. They grow monsters. I felled a Blightroot yesterday. There will be more. Help me end them before Mirthwood forgets how to sing. Barilla tilted her head. The trees scream. We hear. But scream does not mean trust. She moved closer, reaching out one clawed hand and pressing it against his wound. The pain seared white-hot, like fire kissed with salt and ash. He gritted his teeth, refusing to scream. The talons slipped into the wound, pulling forth a thread of green ichor. Warp tained, she hissed. You carry their stink. I carry proof. He spat blood into the soil. I bleed for the forest, not against it. The Dryads whispered among themselves, their voices a rustling choir. Then Varela spoke again. You will have us, Leafwalker, but not just bark and thorn. Others feel the Skaven's claws, old beasts, forgotten ones. Benricus frowned. The Deepwood clans? She nodded, and from the trees beyond, a new figure emerged. Tall as a man, lean and lithe, his armor pieced together from animal hide and scarred metal. A Waywatcher, though no herald of Athaloran. This was Kelwyn, an exile. branded traitor by his own kin for hunting beasts they deemed sacred. His bow was strung with sinew. His gaze was hard as obsidian. "I thought you were dead," Venrilis muttered. "I was," Kaelwyn said flatly. Then the Skaven dug too deep. Awoke things best left sleeping. Venrilis rose, blood crusted along his side. "Then we fight together. The trees need fire. The fire needs steel." Kaelwyn nodded once. "And both need blood." The wind shifted. The forest rustled, not with fear, but anticipation. The war beneath the canopy had found its teeth. And now it would bite back. Chapter 9. Hollow Pact. The Hollow of Grievance was a place spoken of in hushed tones, even among the forest's most ancient spirits. It was not marked on any map. It was not named in song, and it was never spoken of without dread. For deep within its mist-cloaked maw lived something that even the trees feared. Venrilis and Kaelwyn moved in silence, guided by whispers that lived in the bark, in the moss, in the roots that recoiled from their steps. The air here was heavier, clotted with a tension that coiled around the lungs like smoke. Light rarely pierced the canopy, and when it did, it came slanted, twisted, as if reluctant to touch the ground. Behind them came Verhela and two of her Ashborn sisters, drifting like shades, their presence solemn and sharp. Venris could feel the forest bristling, watching them not with wonder, but with warning. The hollow yawned open at the base of a sunken glade, the trees here bent backward, as if recoiling from the great gnarled pit at the center. A circle of stone stood like jagged teeth around the entrance, etched in symbols older than the elven tongue, marks of grief, fury, exile. Kaelwyn stopped. "He waits," he said simply. Venrili stepped forward, and the shadows moved, and something rose from the dark, massive, hunched, its antlers scraping the trees, eyes smoldering with the red of embers buried deep. A beast man, yes, but no mindless raider. This was a Bray shaman of the old blood. His flesh was etched in ritual scars, bones clattered from his belt, and his breath came in fogged clouds of rot and age. "I am Grothka," the beast rumbled. "Why do you call the cursed?" Venrilis did not flinch. "Because you hate the Skaven more than you hate us?" Grothka snorted. "Hate? No. Loathe. Skaven rot everything they touch. They steal what they cannot build, even your forest, even mine." Kaelwyn stepped forward. "Then fight. With us." The Bray shaman tilted his horned head. "You ask alliance of those you hunted? You whose kin burned my kin, made torches of my calves. Why should I not gut you where you stand?" "Because this war burns everything," Venrilis growled, stepping into the beast's shadow. "Skaven poison the roots. They breed Blightroots. They harvest the soul of the forest, and they will come here, to your hollow. They'll take it. Warp it. Turn your sacred glade into a forge of flesh." Grothka's lip curled back, revealing yellowed teeth. Then he reached down, plunging a claw into the ground, dragging up a root, blackened, twitching with warp. Chips they already had. Venrilis's heart sank. The corruption had reached even here. "Then we fight," he said. Grothka rose to full height. "I will give you 50 of my kind, horned, clawed, maddened. We will not obey your orders, we will not march in your formations, but we will kill. That's all we need." The Bray shaman turned to the mist behind him and bellowed. From the shadows they emerged, beastmen of every shape and deformity, muscle-bound, snarling, bearing crude weapons of stone and rusted iron. They came with drum beats made from stretched elf hide and a chants that shook the trees. Eyes full of hate, of hunger, of purpose. Vahala watched with impassive eyes. "You consort with old evil," she said softly. Enrilis didn't look away. Better old evil than no forest at all. The pact had been forged, not with trust, but with fire, ash, claw, and blood. The hollow roared, and war, real war, took its first breath. Chapter 10. Roots and Ruin. The earth trembled before the war even began. Far at the eastern edge of Mirthwood, where the canopy thinned and the soil bled into the rotting swamps of the Skaven's creeping frontier, the forest had gone quiet. Birds had flown days before. Insects had buried themselves deep or simply vanished. Even the trees no longer sang. They only listened. A wet wind crawled through the branches, bearing the scent of metal, oil, and musk. Then the screaming started. It began with the thunder of claws, dozens, then hundreds tearing through foliage. Skein poured from the burrows like a disease erupting from a boil, storm vermin with black iron halberds, gutter runners flitting through the trees like shadows, plague monks dragging censers that coughed foul, green smoke. Behind them came the engines. Massive constructs of rusted plates and stolen wood. Soulwood twisted and bent, grown not by sun or rain, but by warpstone injections and cruel Skaven alchemy. One walked on insect-like legs, spewing warpfire from a cannon in its stomach. Another rolled like a centipede, each segment a screaming cage of tortured wood. A third resembled a towering rat statue fused with tree bark, its arms ending in scythes that whirred with blinding speed. They weren't just weapons. They were violations. Vanrillis watched from the canopy, crouched atop a high limb, his bow already drawn. His shoulder still ached where the Blightroot had pierced him, but he'd bound it tight with runevine. Pain would come later. Below, his forces waited. Kawan stood at the forest floor, flanked by a squad of exiled Waywatchers in bark-scale cloaks, each arrowhead dipped in soulbane toxin. Vaharala and her Ashborn emerged from the trees like walking wildfires, their limbs bristling with ember thorns. And from the hollow, Grothka's beastmen stampeded in a half-mad frenzy, howling their ancient chants, their war paint streaked with blood and mud. They did not wait for orders. They chuckled. The Skaven shrieked, some breaking ranks in fear as the forest itself came alive with fury. Vendrils loosed the first arrow, a signal. It streaked through the dawn haze and struck the lead warpfire thrower in the eye, detonating the fuel tank on its back. The explosion painted the swamp in burning green. Chaos descended like a thunderclap. The beastmen slammed into the left flank, Grothka at the front, wielding a staff of bone capped with a horned skull that crackled with raw magic. He smashed a storm vermin aside, caving in its helmet and skull in one blow. Another lunged, and he tore its throat out with his tusks, spraying blood in an arc that soaked his fur. Varela surged into the center, her dryads screaming songs of vengeance. Their claws tore through armor and fur alike, their touch setting Skein ablaze with cursed flame. One leapt onto a Skaven siege engine, ramming her limbs into the soulwood structure. With a scream, the wood turned on itself, strangling the crew inside. Waywatchers peppered the battlefield from above. Arrows rained like judgment. Skaven fell, choking, bleeding, twitching, as soulbane seared their organs from the inside. But the Skaven were endless. More tunnels opened, more machines clattered forward. One siege beast, massive and quadrupedal, rammed through the Dryad's line, its iron-tipped legs crushing 3 in a heartbeat. Vahala screamed and leapt onto its back, claws digging into metal and root. It bucked wildly, slashing with its bladed tail. But she climbed to its head and drove her limbs into its skull. The beast screamed, a horrible, childlike cry, and exploded. The blast shredded trees, dirt, and bodies alike. When the smoke cleared, Valhalla lay in the crater, barely breathing, her chest pierced by shrapnel. Venrillis dropped beside her, blood in his mouth, blade in hand. She looked up. "Make them burn." He rose. "And," answered. With a roar, he sprinted toward the largest Skaven Worgant, a monstrosity shaped like a rat fused to a siege tower, its belly opening to reveal a nest of warpstone-fused saplings, twisted seeds, corrupted and howling. He didn't hesitate. Venrillis dodged a gout of warpfire, rolled beneath swinging blades, and climbed the beast's side. Claws tore at his legs, one embedded in his calf. He screamed, but kept going. At the top he found the heart, a pulsing sac of veins and warproot. He drove his rune blade into it. The engine screamed. Not mechanical. Not magical. Alive. It writhed, shuddered, and began to collapse. Venrillis leapt free just as the tower beast imploded, its death throes crushing dozens of fleeing Skaven beneath its bulk. Silence followed. Then the forest exhaled. Smoke curled into the air. Corpses littered the roots. The beasts howled in triumph. The Skaven had retreated, but only for now. Venrillis stood amidst the ruin, dripping blood, his blade broken halfway to the hilt. They had won the glade, but the cost had only begun to show. Chapter 11. The First Bloom Burns. The glade reeked of smoke, sap, and scorched fur. The blooming glade, once a sacred cradle of new life, where saplings whispered to the stars and the forest's oldest spirits came to sing the seasons into being, now lay torn open like a corpse on a surgeon's slab. Its once soft carpet of moss and flower had been churned to sludge beneath boots, claws, and iron-shod wheels. The air stank of warp residue and burned roots. Not a single bird-song dared to linger. Venrillis knelt beside the dying form of a treeling, barely more than a child, its bark still soft and silvery. The creature's tiny mouth opened and closed in a silent scream, sap bubbling from the slashed ridges in his torso. Its eyes, pure orbs of amber light, flickered like dying stars. He whispered to it, his hands pressed to its wounds. But there was nothing left to save. The light faded. Venrillis rose, covered in its blood, and turned toward the center of the grove. That was where the machine stood. 3 Skaven had died building it, burned alive by errant surges of warpfire, or crushed by the massive gears. It didn't matter to them. Sacrifice was cheap. The device was a towering tangle of pipes, roots, and metal conduits, fed by one of the corrupted seeds of Shaladrin. Warp energy throbbed through tubes that pierced into the soil, drawing power from the lifeblood of the glade itself. Each beat of the engine's core sent out a low thum, like the drumbeat of something vast and ancient being awakened beneath the earth. Venrillis's heart pounded in time with it. Kaelwyn crouched beside him in the underbrush, his bow ready, his face streaked with dirt and blood. They've rooted the machine into the bloom's core. It's feeding, drinking the glade's essence like water. Then we starve it, Venrillis said. Rip it out, root and gear. A howl answered them. Not Skaven. Beastmen. Grothka's warband emerged from the western tree line, teeth bared, weapons slick with blood from the last skirmish. He led them at full charge, leaping over collapsed trees and trenches with startling grace for his massive frame. They hit the Skaven lines with all the subtlety of a falling mountain. Venrillis and Kaelwyn charged behind them, and the first Skaven barely had time to shriek before Venrillis's blade cleaved through its skull, split it clean down the middle. Another lunged at him with a warpick. He sidestepped and buried a dagger in its armpit, twisting until he felt the shoulder sockets snap loose. Above, Kaelwyn rained arrows on the engineers around the machine. One took a shaft through the throat and toppled, gurgling. Another had its leg pinned to the metal frame, screaming as a second arrow drilled through its eye. Grothka roared through the enemy ranks, swinging his bone staff like a scythe. One swipe crushed a Ratman's chest into paste. Another swing cracked a warpfire canister, bathing the nearby Skaven in their own weapon. They ignited in an instant, squealing and flailing as their flesh melted from their bones. But the machine fought back. One of its roots lashed out like a whip, knocking a beastman clean off his feet and into a tree where his spine snapped like dry twigs. Another tendril burst from the ground and coiled around a dryad, lifting her into the air. She screamed, her body convulsing as the root drained her essence. Her leaves blackened and crumbled, her bark withered. Ventrilis roared and leapt. He landed on the machine's chassis, climbing with dagger and blade, carving into the cables as he went. Sparks erupted, the entire construct shuddered. Green light flared from the central chamber, a heart of pulsing wood and metal, the seed embedded at its core. It saw him. The eye blinked, and then, with a terrible scream, the machine awoke fully. Blades extended, gears whirred, roots lashed in every direction. It became a beast, not a tool, alive with the madness of both Skaven design and forest magic warped beyond recognition. It struck wildly, slicing two beastmen in half. Venrilis reached the heart. He drew the broken rune blade, gripping it with both hands. The seed pulsed. The eye widened. He stabbed. The blade pierced bark and crystal. The machine shrieked, a sound that sent birds fleeing from miles around. Warp energy exploded outward, knocking Venrilis from the frame. He landed hard, cracking ribs against root and stone. The explosion was a rising sun of green fire and white sap. It consumed the blooming glade. When the light faded, silence fell. The machine was gone, scattered in molten fragments and burning vines. The seed had been annihilated, consumed in its own dying scream. But so too had the bloom. What had once been a sanctuary of life was now a crater of ash and smoking roots. The soil was black. The trees that remained wept pitch. The spirits of the glade had fled, their whispers replaced by groans. Benreili stood amidst the ruin, chest heaving, blood pouring from his side. Caelwyn approached, grim-faced. "It's dead." Bendros didn't look at him. "No," he murmured, "it was born, and this was just its first breath." He stared into the smoldering pit. The war had only begun. Chapter 12. Blood, Sap and Fire. The forest bled. Where once clear streams had trickled through glades of songbirds and ancient ferns, now ran rivulets of sap tinged red with blood. The roots of mirthwood twisted in agony, buckling under a corruption that could no longer be ignored. Trees groaned in the night, not from wind, but from pain. Bark blistered, leaves fell before their time. Venrilis moved like a shadow. Blood still caked on his armor from the blooming glade, each breath a fresh stab beneath cracked ribs. The memory of the seed's eye haunted his thoughts, how it saw him, how it screamed when it died. As if it were not a weapon, but a child. He pushed deeper into the forest, toward the eastern marchlands, the battleground where dryads and way-watchers had made their stand against a new incursion. They were already dead. He found them scattered through the underbrush, bodies twisted in unnatural poses. One way-watcher's corpse had been nailed to a tree by his own arrows, his mouth pried open and stuffed with moss. Another had been gutted and splayed over a rootstone, her entrails woven into Skaven glyphs. The dryads had not fared better. One had been hollowed from within, her core burned by warp flame, leaving her barky shell still standing upright. Arms outstretched in a silent scream. Venrilis knelt by her, pressing a hand to the scorched wood. Her spirit was gone, nothing left but pain carved into silence. He stood slowly, drawing his blade. Something skittered. Then the underbrush exploded. Skaven lunged from all sides, 10, 12, maybe more, some bearing crude chisel knives, others wielding warp-infected saws and spiked tools. They moved with wild hunger, eyes glowing in the dim gloom, fur slick with filth and gore. Venrillis moved like a storm. He parried the first with a clang of steel, twisting his blade inside the Rutman's guard and severing its arm at the elbow. The Skaven shrieked and fell back, clutching the spurting stump. A second dove for his throat. Venrillis ducked low and drove a dagger through the creature's gut, lifting and twisting until intestines spilled over his boot. But they came faster. He caught a spear thrust in the ribs, the tip driving into the cracked plate just below his heart. He gasped, staggering. Another slashed his thigh, the blade carving deep. His vision blurred. He screamed, a cry of fury and pain, and released the Rundvine clasp on his gauntlet. The forest answered. Roots burst from the soil, coiling like serpents. One whipped around a Skaven's neck and tightened, the crack of cartilage echoing through the trees. Another pulled a ratman underground, its screams muffled by soil and sap. A third root impaled two at once, lifting them into the air like trophies. Venris stumbled to his knees, blood pouring from his wounds. And then came the fire. From beyond the clearing, Warpfire ignited, a swirling arc of green flame that hissed as it spread, eating trees, moss, and flesh alike. A Skane Warpfire thrower advanced, its tank gurgling, nozzle spitting embers. The trees screamed. And Dryad, barely alive, rose from behind a rock, her body half burned, one arm gone. She charged the flame wielder with a shriek, slamming into it with such force that both toppled. The canister cracked and exploded. The shock wave lit the clearing in brilliant green agony. Sap ignited, leaves fell like cinders, the ground turned to ash. Venrillis was hurled backward, striking a tree with bone-snapping force. He lay stunned, deafened by the blast, his lungs tasting fire. Smoke curled through the ruins of the forest. Skaven bodies littered the clearing, charred and smoking. He crawled to his feet, eyes watering. The Dryad's body was gone, nothing but ash and scorched root. And beyond the flames, more Skaven waited. Watching, waiting, but they didn't charge. Instead, they slowly withdrew, vanishing into the smoke. Not routed, not afraid, satisfied. Venrillis's blood ran cold. This wasn't a random ambush, it was a test, a sacrifice. The Skaven were feeding the fire, feeding the forest's pain, and with every battle, the land grew weaker, more poisoned, more twisted. He fell to one knee, coughing blood, the scent of burned bark in his nose. This wasn't war. It was harvesting, and Mirthwood was running out of time. Chapter 13. The Druid's Warning. Night descended on Mirthwood like a plague of ink, thick and choking. The stars, once bright watchers of elven dreams, had vanished behind black clouds that roiled without wind. Even the moon seemed hesitant, its light reduced to a sickly smear of pale yellow through the canopy. Venrillis moved slowly through the deadwood paths, guided only by memory and the faint glimmer of firefly wisps, creatures drawn to sorrow like moths to flame. His wounds still ached, his ribs wrapped in bark-pressed poultices, but pain had become background noise now. The war was louder. He passed what remained of the Emerald Grove. It had been sacred once, a place of healing where druids whispered to the wind and leaves danced in spirals of joy. Now it lay open and still. Trees stripped of their bark, roots exposed like flayed muscle. The ground was scorched in crescent patterns, as if something had walked here that burned the earth simply by being. At the center stood a figure. He looked like a man once, tall, robed in moss and thorn, beard flowing like hanging lichen. But his flesh had long begun to merge with the forest. His legs were roots, his arms, elongated branches adorned with tiny blossoms that shivered in his presence. His face bore the calm terror of age and futility. He was Thalaner, last of the wild-bound druids. Vendrelis approached and bowed his head. "Old Root," he said quietly, "I seek counsel." Thalaner did not move, but his voice resonated through the clearing, not from his mouth, but from the trees themselves. "You seek counsel when you should seek forgiveness." Benrimbo stood slowly, blood on his fingers, ash on his cloak. "I have no time for penance. The forest dies." Thalaner's eyes opened, milky white and ringed with green tears. "The forest dies because you fight, because you bring war into its veins. This soil was never meant to drink blood." Venril stepped forward, his voice cold. "Then let the Skaven take it. Let them root their machines and raise their monsters. Let the seeds scream as they're twisted into weapons." "You have already heard the screaming," Thalanar whispered. "You've seen what your blade cannot fix. The blooming glade, the Blightroot, the fire. You think these are Skaven crimes alone?" Venrelis frowned. "You speak in riddles." Dalanir raised a hand. Leaves shivered. From the soil, something rose. A vision, not illusion, memory. The glade shimmered into a time long past, trees green and strong, spirits singing in the branches. Then came war, elves in silver armor, beastmen in frenzy, blood spilled, fire raged, and the soil blackened. Phelanir's voice echoed through the illusion. "Long before the Skaven, we brought ruin. We sowed war, and the forest bled. That pain never left. It only waited." The vision warped. The Skaven appeared, tunneling, laughing, dragging machines. But they weren't invading. They were answering, drawn to the scar, to the old blood, to the rot already beneath. "They grow their filth in soil we poisoned," Thalanir said, "and now you feed that poison with fire and vengeance." Fenrilis's heart twisted. He stepped back, breathing ragged. "If we do nothing, we lose everything. If you keep fighting," Thalanar said, "you become them." A pause. Then, softly, the druid added, "There is another way." Venrilis narrowed his eyes. "What way?" "The old path. The verdant banishment. A ritual not of blade or fire, but of memory. It would cut Mirthwood off from the world, bury it in dream. The Skaven would vanish. The war would end. But so would we," Venrelis breathed. "We'd lose our ties, our roads, our future." Dalamir's eyes dimmed. "Yes. But the forest would live." Venrilis turned away, staring into the broken trees. He saw Kaelwyn's bloodied face, Viralla's burned body, the blight roots, the seed's eye, and in the wind, the distant sound of digging. More Skaven, always more. He looked back. "Not yet," he said. "Let me try. One more push. One final blow." Thalaner nodded, slow and mournful. "But remember this, elf. Each drop of Skaven blood feeds the corruption, and your own rage may be its truest seed." Venrilis turned and walked into the dark. The forest whispered behind him, and Thalanir faded into root and bark once more. Chapter 14. Gnawing on the Veins. Beneath the oldest trees of Mirthwood, trees whose roots had tasted the blood of dragons and drunk from rains before the world knew fire, something writhed. Not natural, not right. The land was shifting from within, like a beast scratching at the lining of its own belly. Then Rillis crouched atop a ruined outpost tower, his gaze fixed on the clearing below. There, carved into the belly of the forest's deepest grove, The Skaven had opened a wound, a wide sinkhole of gnashed earth and shattered root that pulsed with dark energy. They had found it. The Heartline. The Heartline was not a myth. It was real. A vast subterranean root system that connected every grove, every glade, every whisper of Mirthwood into one shared lifeblood. It was the forest's mind, memory, and soul. And the Skaven were drilling into it. A monstrous drill engine, fused from Skaven scrap and warped soulwood limbs, churned endlessly, its great spiral lined with runes and powered by a spinning warp core that throbbed like a corrupted heart. Pipes ran from it like leeches, draining the amber lifeblood from the roots and funneling it into vats. The liquid pulsed with ghostlight. Spirits wept within. Around the machine, dozens of Skaven worked feverishly, engineers, slave-casters, flesh-tinkerers, and warlock adepts, all guarded by hulking rat ogres with eyes stitched shut and limbs replaced by drills and flails. Benrilla's hand tightened around his bow. Beside him, Kaelwyn stared with horror. "They're drinking the forest's soul," the Waywatcher whispered. "It's screaming." Benris nodded once, then let it scream through us. They didn't wait for backup. They fell. Arrows sang first, Venerables and Kaelwyn loosing volley after volley into the densest clusters of Skaven. One engineer collapsed backward, an arrow buried in his snout, limbs twitching. Another tried to sound the alarm, but a shaft pierced his throat before the scream could leave his lungs. The rat ogres roared. Then Rillis leapt into the pit, blades drawn, landing atop one of the Skaven slave overseers and driving both daggers down through its collarbone with a wet crunch. Blood sprayed his face. He rolled forward, narrowly avoiding the spiked flail of an ogre, and slashed across its hamstring. The beast howled, collapsed to one knee, only for Kaelwyn's arrow to punch through its temple a heartbeat later. Skaven scattered in chaos, but the machine kept turning. One of the warlock adepts scrambled to a lever, shrieking, "Defend! More juice bleed! Break roots faster!" He yanked the switch. The drill screamed. It shuddered and surged forward, boring deeper into the earth. Roots split and writhed around it. The ground shook. Ember blood sprayed into the air, and with it came something worse. Spirits. Not peaceful. Not whole. Wraiths emerged from the lifeblood, elven, dryad, beast, twisted into forms of agony, mouths open in eternal screams. The machine had not just drilled, it had devoured memory. Kaelin faltered. Bendrillis grabbed his arm. "Don't look at them. Fight." They charged the core. 3 rat ogres stood in their path. One came swinging with a chain fist, each link made of jagged bone. Venrilis ducked, then vaulted upward, using the beast's thigh as a step to launch onto its back. He plunged a blade into the seam of its spine, tearing downward. The creature thrashed, bellowing as green ichor fountained from its wound. It collapsed, convulsing. Kaelwyn rolled beneath another, firing 3 arrows point blank into its chest. They didn't kill, but slowed it. That was enough. A dryad appeared from nowhere, leaping from a shadow, screaming her grief, and impaled the ogre with her arm. Roots burst from her bark flesh, coiling through the creature's chest, choking it from within. They died together, entwined. The last ogre charged. Venrilis met it head-on. He activated his gauntlet. Rundrud burst from the ground, entangling the beast's legs. He leapt, bringing both blades down into its skull with a roar. The weapons sank deep, scraping bone, and the ogre dropped with a seismic crash. They reached the machine's core. It pulsed like an open wound. Warp runes danced across the metal. The seed that powered it, half dead, half awake, throbbed inside a chamber of glass and iron, its eye wide and crying. Venrilis hesitated. He saw himself in the reflection, bloodied, broken, burning, with vengeance. Then he drew the broken rune blade and rammed it through the core. The explosion ripped the sky. The ground tore upward. Roots convulsed. Screams echoed from the spirits, deafening, heart-rending. The drill imploded, crushing the surrounding vats and flooding the pit with amber blood. Skaven died by the dozens, drowned, burned, impaled on roots that had awoken with fury. Some tried to flee, but the forest had no mercy left. Benrillis and Kaelwyn crawled from the pit, gasping, soaked in sap and blood. All around them, trees groaned. The heartline had been wounded, but not broken. Not yet. Vendrillis looked to the horizon. If the Skaven were willing to drink the forest's soul, then there was nothing they wouldn't do. He whispered to the trees, and the trees whispered back. Chapter 15. Roots of Resistance. Ash and sap mingled in the air like incense from a funeral pyre. The wreckage of the Heartline's desecration still smoldered behind Venrillis as he limped through the war-torn underbrush. His blade was broken, his gauntlet scorched. The forest cries had not stopped, they merely quieted into the low, exhausted moan of a creature left bleeding and wide-eyed. But in that stillness came rage. The forest had remembered. All around him, the trees quivered not with fear, but awakening. Long-dormant spirits, those ancient guardians once slumbering in root and ring, now stirred. The souls devoured by Skaven machines had left behind more than grief. They had left fury. Awen emerged from the dark at his side, his armor splintered, his arrows spent. "There are whispers in the roots," he said. "The grove sentinels are waking." "And the treekin?" "They're marching, without command, without question." Venrillis touched the earth. It throbbed beneath his fingers. He stood slowly, each movement strained and soaked in pain, and turned toward the scorched western glade, once a haven for song and healing. Now the last bastion, before the war reached the inner sanctum of Mirthwood. He had no more time. Venrillis raised his voice. "Gather them." Within the hour they came. The Dryads arrived first. Varela still wounded but unbroken, her body scorched with ash marks like sacred scars. The Ashborn encircled her, their bark adorned with blackened vines that pulsed with slow-burning fire. She did not speak. Her eyes alone were enough. Next came the Waywatchers, silent, spectral, cloaked in leaf and bone. Kaelwyn led them like a reaper with a quiver, his face painted with war ash, his eyes hollow with purpose. Then, from the deeps, came the beasts. Grofka stood at the head of 200 beastmen, his horns bound in runic iron, his staff crowned with the jawbone of a dead rat ogre. They stomped and howled as they marched, banging rusted weapons against their chests. They had been promised blood. They came to collect. And then thunder. The ground shook. The trees parted. And the treekin came. Towering figures of bark and root, moss-bearded and silent. They moved like living storms, each footstep cracking stone and soil. Their eyes burned with verdant fire. Some bore weapons, axes of petrified wood, flails made of thorned vines, but most fought with fists the size of boulders. Venrillis stepped before them all, bloodied, tired, hollow, but undefeated. He raised the broken rune blade high, its jagged edge still gleaming with sap and soullight. "The Skaven have carved into our hearts," he said, voice booming across the glade. "They have bled our soil, twisted our seeds, and scorched our memories." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Now we answer. We carve back. We purge, we drive their filth from these woods, not for honor, not for vengeance, but because this is our home, and I will not let them make it a tomb." A roar answered. Dryads shrieked. Beastmen howled. The Treecans slammed their fists into the earth as one. And then they marched. The final charge began at dusk. Benrilis led the vanguard through the old dwarven pass, a forgotten stone bridge wound in ivy and time. The Skaven had fortified it with scavenged war machines and barricades of splintered timber and bone, but they were not ready for this. The first Treecan crashed through the wall like a siege ram with eyes. A storm vermin was crushed beneath its heel, body rupturing like a dropped fruit. Arrows filled the air, green-fletched and humming with elven sorcery. Skaven fell choking, spasming, as soulbane burned through their bloodstreams. Barella tore through a flank like wildfire, setting trees ablaze with her fury. One Skaven burst into flames before it could scream. Another was impaled on a spike of root that drove through its spine and twisted. Hrothgar launched into the center, bellowing a chant of madness. He smashed aside 2 rat ogres, then seized a warlock by the throat and bit through its skull. Bone cracked, blood sprayed. He howled and flung the corpse into a warp engine, igniting it in a thunderous green blast. Benrilis ran the ramparts, cutting down fleeing Skaven with terrifying precision. His daggers blurred in his hands, one stroke across a throat, another deep into a stomach, twisting until the screams gurgled into silence. He moved like the forest's fury made flesh. The Skaven broke. They fled. But the forest did not forgive. The roots rose behind them, tearing tunnels apart, collapsing exits. One escape shaft filled with thick vines that grew thorns as long as swords. The ratmen screamed as they were skewered, bodies writhing on the growing stakes. By nightfall, it was over. The bridge was theirs. The forest stood quiet. Benrilis looked upon the field of corpses. Ratmen twisted and burned, still twitching in death. Trees wept sap that ran like tears. The cost was high, but the message was clear. The forest fought back, and war had truly begun. Chapter 16. The Rotten Heart. The sky over Mirthwood bruised with morning light, but there was no warmth in its color, only the pallor of a new wound, born before the old could scab. The forest stood in silence, caught in the pause between a battle ended and another one begun. Leaves hung limp, and birdsong had abandoned the trees entirely. All that remained was the breathing of roots, shallow, strained. Benrilis descended into the deep hollow, where the soil changed color, amber fading to gray, and then to a sickly black. He moved alone now. The others tended their dead, or prepared for the next push. But this path, this discovery, had to be walked without witness. He followed the tunnel carved not by dwarves or trees, but by unnatural force. Skaven drills had once turned through this rock like worms through rot, but now the machines were long gone. Only the scar remained, and the stench. It was not just the smell of rot. It was the scent of something living that should not be alive. The tunnel led to a chamber the size of a cathedral, hidden beneath Mirthwood's oldest roots. Stone and soil gave way to something else, growth. The walls pulsed with living bark, dark and wet, veins of warp crystal threading through the grain like infection. In the center, on a bed of root flesh, lay the heartroot crystal, once the purest relic of Mirthwood's spirit, now mutated. Its surface glowed green, not gold. Its base had been fused with iron rings and arcane turbines. The Skaven had not just drained it. They had harnessed it. Benrilis approached with reverence, but his fingers itched on the hilt of his dagger. His body was exhausted, his soul worn thin, but the sight of the heartroot twisted his stomach into cold knots. This had been a conduit once, channeling the dreams of the forest into blooming glades and sacred groves. Now it screamed, quietly, Constantly, voices whispered from within. Names of dead trees, the cries of dryads as they burned, the laughter of Skaven engineers, and at its center pulsed an eye, like the seeds, but older, deeper, away. Vendrolas, it hissed, not aloud, but in the marrow of his bones. He drew his blade. I am what remains. The Heartroot whispered. Skitterfang's voice. Your voice. We are the same. You fight, you burn, you change. The forest feeds on rage now. You gave it this taste. No, Venrisis growled, stepping closer. You were twisted. I was revealed. The voice rasped through his spine. There is no purity, only what survives. Skitterfang knew. I grew through his teeth. I bled into his mind. A shape emerged from the roots behind the crystal, a malformed dryad, or what had once been one. Its face was a mosaic of bark and Skaven skin, half skeletal, half leaf. It dragged itself forward on fingers fused with rusted claws. Venrilis recoiled. It opened its mouth, and out poured sap, black, bubbling, boiling. I am the forest, it groaned. I am its hunger, its revenge. Let me grow through you. It lunged. Venrilis struck. His dagger pierced the creature's chest, but the blade stuck, caught in wood and warp. The creature slammed into him, claws scraping against his armor. One gouged his shoulder, another caught his face, ripping a gash across his cheekbone. He screamed and twisted, pulling his secondary blade from his belt and driving it up under the monster's jaw. It thrashed violently, spewing blood sape in globs, and then collapsed, twitching. The Heartroot pulsed harder. Venrilis rose slowly, face drenched in sap and blood. Kill me, the crystal whispered, and kill the forest. Leave me, and I will spread. He looked down at his own hands, one trembling, the other slick with ichor. The whisper of Thalanir came back to him. Each drop of Skaven blood feeds the corruption, and your own rage may be its truest seed. Venrilis turned his back on the crystal. He would not break it. Not yet. He drew a rune cloth from his pouch and pressed it to the wound in his side. The crystal behind him throbbed, shrieked, begged. But he was already climbing, back toward the light, and the forest wept silently behind him. Chapter 17. Kalwan's Sacrifice. The rain came soft and steady, pattering on leaf and branch with a rhythm that once might have soothed, but now fell like drumbeats counting down to the end. The forest breathed slowly, each drop drawing deeper into the wounds of the world. Venrilis stood at the edge of a clearing, soaked in the afterbirth of war, blood mingling with rain, pooling in the roots, the soil sucking it down like wine. Behind him, the makeshift camp flickered with torchlight, shadows shifting across the twisted remnants of trees. Before him, silence. Kaywin approached, silent as always, cloak tattered and soaked, his bow slung over one shoulder, face unreadable behind streaks of ash and sap. He stood beside Venrilis, eyes locked on the horizon, where the mist broke just enough to reveal their destination. A fortress, if it could be called such. A crude bastion of rusted steel, woven roots and bone, built around the remains of an old elven observatory. The Skaven had taken it, warped it, grown into it. Pipes jutted from its sides like veins, spewing smoke and raw warp energy into the sky. At its heart pulsed a node of green light. The conduit, the final one. It fed the whole lattice, linked the seeds, the blightroots, the warp trees. If it fell, the entire system would collapse. But it was heavily guarded. Hundreds of Skaven milled within and around the fortress, warlock engineers, storm vermin, Jizzail snipers. even 2 hell-pit abominations that circled the perimeter like starved dogs. Venrillis exhaled slowly. Too many. Not if we split them, Kalen said softly. Venrillis turned to him. You've got something in mind. Kawen nodded. They know you. They fear you. Your blood is in their reports. You are the war. You go to the east wall. Let them see you. Let them chase. Benrias frowned. That's suicide. Kawen looked at the fortress again. It will not be me they chase. Then he stepped away, drew his cloak tight, and pulled something from his satchel, a bundle wrapped in barkskin. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a relic of old Athel and Ern, an explosive seed born of death and rage, forbidden by druidic law. A single seedling that, once awakened, would erupt in a storm of flame and shrapnel, burning soul and flesh alike. Kalen, Venris began, voice thickening. I will breach the no chamber, Kalen said, not looking back. You lead the strike once it's done. Take the heart root while you still can. Venrillis's throat tightened. You won't make it out. Calwyn finally turned. For a moment, there was no fire, no Skaven, no war. Only 2 elves under the breath of the trees, soaked and bleeding, and old before their time. I am already gone, Venrillis. I died the moment we let them grow roots in our forest. Venrillis placed a hand on his shoulder. Then walk proud, Kaelwyn of the Ash Trail. Your name will be carved in oak. Kaelwyn smiled, soft, tired. Don't carve it. Let it grow wild. And then he vanished into the mist. The next hour passed in heartbeats. Venrillis waited in the eastern woods, blades drawn, shadows tight around him. From the western ridge he heard the scream of Warpfire. The Skaven shrieked, alarms rang, the ground shook. Kalen had entered. Then came the second wave, explosions, smoke, an unnatural flame, screams of storm vermin, the howl of a hell-pit beast enraged. Arrows flew, steel clashed, and above it all, a sound like the forest itself crying out in fury. Venrillis and his warband surged forward. The east wall cracked beneath Treekin fists. Beastmen howled their war cries and flung themselves over the barricades. Dryads surged through the gaps, claws and fire against chittering panic. Inside, Venrillis ran through smoke and falling bodies, past Skaven riddled with arrows and crushed beneath debris. He reached the core chamber. It was already ablaze. The walls pulsed erratically, the seed in the conduit chamber thrashing violently, its eye bleeding light. Roots twisted, spasmed, and tore themselves free. The node screamed. Above it, pinned to the wall by a shard of twisted root, hung Kaelwyn, impaled through the waist but alive, barely. Blood ran down his legs. His bow was snapped in half beside him. Venrillis ran to him. Kaelwyn's eyes met his. Do it, he whispered. Light it. Venrillis reached into his pouch, pulled the second part of the explosive, wrapped in runes and bone. He pressed it into Kaelwyn's hand. Taewyn closed his fingers around it and smiled through the blood. Run. Venrillis turned, and ram. He fled the core as it buckled. Roots curled inward. The air split with the scream of the seed. Then, fire, green and white, flame and sap. The fortress cracked like a dying heart. A column of light shot into the sky, searing the clouds. The explosion rolled through the forest, toppling trees, vaporizing machines. And at its center, Kaelwyn, U.S. employee. But the seed was dead. The network severed. And the war truly changed. Venrilli stood among the burning remains. He did not weep. He whispered a name into the bark of a nearby tree. and the tree whispered it back. Chapter 18. A Forest Weeps. The fire had passed, but its memory clung to the woods like a scab that would never crust over. Charred trunks stood as monuments to sacrifice. The smoke had cleared, but it left behind silence. Not peace, not rest, but the silence of exhaustion, the kind that follows weeping. Fenris walked alone through the wreckage of the Skaven fortress. His boots crushed shattered bone and twisted metal with each step. The air still carried a bitter tang of scorched warpstone and burned flesh. He had passed a dozen bodies, Skaven, dryads, beastmen, all of them tangled in death, blackened and bloated. The tree he whispered Kaelin's name to still stood, though its leaves had turned silver with grief. It wicked. Drops of amber fell from its bark like tears, slow and steady, dripping into the bloodied soil. Beneath it, grass had begun to regrow, pale and strange, with tips that glowed faintly blue in the half-light. Not corrupted, changed. Venrillis knelt, brushing his fingers across the soil. Still warm, still whispering. The forest had bled here, deep. Something moved behind him. He turned fast, blade half-drawn. A treekin shambled from the ruin, its bark scorched, one arm missing, its face cracked along the cheek like broken pottery. It walked with heavy, uneven steps, each movement releasing a groan from deep within its chest. It did not speak. It simply collapsed to one knee before him and laid something at his feet. The broken Warpfire core. Still glowing, still leaking. Venrillis picked it up, wrapping it quickly in his cloak, the heat burning through the fabric. He stood, and the treekin looked up at him, eyes dimming. "No more," it rasped, in a voice like boulders grinding beneath roots. "No more pain." Then it stilled. The light faded. Its body collapsed into bark and soil, taken back by the forest. Venrillis clenched his jaw, fists trembling. From the trees, whispers rose. Faint. Feral. The beast-man. Grotka emerged from the mist, flanked by his brood. His horns were painted with blood, his fur clumped with sap and gore. The jawbone atop his staff dripped red. "You promised war," Grotka growled, voice thick with hunger. "Now they run, scatter, hide in their holes. We want more." Venrillis stood. "You'll get more, but not like this." Grotka sneered. "You speak like leaflings. Still think this forest can be saved." "I don't think it," Venrillis snapped. "I fight for it." The beast's eyes narrowed. "And if it can't be saved?" Venrillis looked around. The burned trees, the bleeding roots, the dying spirits. "Then we make sure it's avenged." Grotka grunted approval. But the forest heard more. All around them the trees began to change. Not visibly, not physically, but spiritually. Something in the root paths shifted. The whispers grew louder. The pulse of the land grew faster. Venrillis felt it. The forest wasn't just hurt. It was angry. He dropped to one knee, pressing both hands into the soil. Visions flashed through his mind. New seed. Grown not by choice but by hate, pulsing in a Skaven lab. A tunnel network, spiraling deeper than ever before, lined with warp runes and veins of green fire. A Narc Skittering. The warlock stood before a cauldron of living root and stone, his flesh more machine now than beast. He cackled, drinking in the screams of a dryad bound to a metal crucifix, feeding her agony to the seed growing beneath him. Venrillis gasped and pulled back, his breath ragged, blood dripping from his nose. "He's not done," he whispered. "Skittering is not done." Grotka bared his teeth. "Where?" Venrillis looked north. past the scorched trees, past the rivers, past the edge of maps, into the hollow spire. That's where he's gone. That's where he's becoming something worse. Othkar turned to his beasts. Then we hunt. Benrelis nodded, gaze fixed on the black horizon. The forest wept, but it no longer wept alone. It wept with teeth. Chapter 19. The Price of War. The path to Hollowspire was not a trail, but a wound, a gash carved through the northern stretches of Mirthwood, where the forest had grown twisted beyond recognition. Trees leaned inward as if whispering secrets no sane ear could bear. Their bark had turned pale and brittle, flecked with strange symbols, Skaven glyphs etched in blood and warped sap. The roots moved when they thought no one was looking. Benrelis walked ahead of his warband, silent, grim, driven not by hope, but necessity. The soil beneath his boots felt soft, too soft, like flesh. It pulsed underfoot. It was alive in the wrong way. He could feel it now. The corruption had seeped so deep that it no longer waited to be summoned. It called out with every step closer to Hollowspire. The forest's soul screamed louder, no longer with fear, but madness. They reached the perimeter just past dusk. Hollowspire rose from the center of a dead basin, a tower once built by the ancients to chart the stars, now reduced to a hollowed skeleton of stone and root. Skaven scaffolding clung to it like a cancer, pipes jutting out at wild angles, spilling foul-smelling smoke into the clouds above. Beneath it stretched a yawning tunnel, the mouth of Nark Skitterfang's final nest. They had reached the edge of the nightmare. Then Rillis turned to his warband. Dryads cloaked in ash, Waywatchers bearing soulfire arrows, Grothka and his beastmen caked in blood and hunger. Treekin loomed in the distance, silent, watching. None asked for speeches. None needed them. Benrelis simply nodded. They moved. The attack was swift, brutal, and immediate. Beastmen smashed into the outer defenses with thunderous fury, their crude blades and clubs ripping through the first wave of Skaven defenders. Dryads slipped between shadows, their claws opening throats and bellies in flashes of crimson. Waywatchers loosed volleys of arrows, each shaft ignited on impact, setting alchemical war machines ablaze. One struck a warp gun's fuel chamber, causing a brilliant green explosion that vaporized 4 ratmen and a dozen yards of scaffolding. But for every Skaven killed, 3 more took its place. From beneath Hollowspire, the new ones emerged. Not ratmen, not beasts. Abled hybrids, spined monstrosities of root and fur, fused with warp-infused bark, claws lined with iron and thorns. Their eyes glowed like emerald fire, and their screams were layered, rat squeals mixed with the pain cries of once-living trees. One leapt at a treekin and bit through its arm. Another skewered a dryad on a tail blade and spun her like a flag. She burned from within, exploding into ash. Grothka met one of the beasts head-on, his staff clashing with its claws. They tore at each other like wolves, Grothka's blood mixing with sap as the beast's fangs sank into his side. But the Bray Shaman roared, grabbed the creature's throat, and crushed its windpipe with a snap like a snapped branch. He spat blood and kept going. Then Rillis fought with the precision of a predator. His blades moved like wind through leaves, silent, lethal. One swipe opened a rat's skull, another drove through the eye of a hybrid, the blade singing as it split brain and root alike. But it wasn't enough. Not fast enough. He reached the mouth of the tunnel, Skaven pouring from it like maggots from a wound. Then he hesitated. He felt it, deep inside the earth. The thrum, the calling. Not just warp. Memory. The heart-root crystal still pulsed, alive, mutated, beneath Skitterfang's control. And in that instant he made the choice. He reached into his satchel. and pulled out a shard of corrupted seed. Warp-tainted, forbidden, but alive. He crushed it in his fist. Power surged through his veins like molten lead. The forest screamed in his mind, his veins lit up, his eyes burned, and he became something more than elf. Venrilis surged forward, blades now singing, each strike laced with unnatural force. He split one hybrid in half with a single upward stroke. Another exploded into a spray of bark and bone when his dagger found its heart. His warband faltered behind him, watching, confused, afraid. Grothka hissed. "He has touched the root," Varela screamed from behind. "He tames himself." Venrilis didn't care. He pushed into the tunnel, alone, toward Skitterfang, and toward the heart. And behind him the forest wailed, not in warning, but as mourning. Chapter 20. Twilight Rebellion. The tunnel swallowed him whole. Venrilis ran deeper into the earth, each step echoing like a war drum down walls slick with living root and vein. His pulse matched the rhythm. The shard of corrupted seed he had crushed moments ago coursed through him, binding his spirit to something old and vast and angry. His skin pulsed with unnatural warmth. His blood felt thicker. His thoughts came sharper, faster, louder. And beneath it all, whispers. Voices that weren't his. "You're stronger now, Leafwalker," they hissed. "Faster, better. Be the blade, be the fire." But he couldn't answer. Not yet. The tunnel narrowed, became jagged, roots twisted like broken bones through stone, wrapped around veins of warp crystal that bled green light. Strange symbols burned along the walls, skaven runes of binding and growth, stitched over ancient elf glyphs that once protected these sacred depths. He passed corpses, twisted dryads, bark peeled from their torsos, faces frozen in horror. A waywatcher hung from a vine, strangled by his own bowstring. The air stank of oil, death, and wild magic gone wrong. And a headlight. He entered a chamber vast as the sky. It had once been a seed sanctuary, a place where the forest's first memories had been planted. Now it was a cathedral of blasphemy. At its center loomed the heartroot crystal, impaled by iron spikes, roots stretched and pinned like the limbs of a crucified god. Warp tubes fed into it, pulsing. Its core flickered between gold and green, conflicted. And beside it, Nark Skitterfang, or what had become of him. He was barely rat anymore. His body had grown tall, elongated. One side was all skaven fur and bone, twitching with warped muscle. The other was fused with bark, soulwood, crystal, and metal. His tail was gone, replaced by a whip of root and steel. His eyes were unequal, one a gleaming orb of warp glass, the other a living knot of the heartroot's wood. He turned, hissing laughter from a mouth too wide for nature. "Come, come, elf thing," he rasped. See your forest's new god." Venrilis answered with steel. He lunged forward, blades flashing. One slash, then another, each strike aimed to kill, to end. Narks twisted with inhuman speed, deflecting the blows with his root arm, countering with a shriek that sent roots exploding from the ground. Venrilis dodged, rolled, threw a dagger. It sank into Skitterfang's side, but the rat only laughed. Blood, black and glowing, oozed down his ribs, and vines stitched the wound closed instantly. "You bled feed from the seed, yes? Tasted its power," Skitterfang grinned. "We are same now." They clashed again. Steel met claw, root met blade. Venrilis slashed across Nark's bark arm, severing fingers, only to be struck in the chest by a gout of warp energy. He flew backward, slammed into the roots, coughed blood. Skitterfang stalked closer. "Your forest loves this. Pain, blood, war. You gave it purpose. Benrillis rose slowly, blood dripping from his mouth. "Wrong," he growled. "You taught it to scream. I'll teach it to fight." He called on the seed's power. His hands glowed. The blades in his palms pulsed with both forest magic and something else, tainted, yes, but fierce. He leapt forward again, faster than before. Each blow carved bark from Skitterfang's limbs. Blood sprayed, sparks flew. He stabbed one blade into the warlock's stomach and twisted. Skitterfang shrieked. But then his root arm lashed out, impaling Venrillis through the side. Venrillis gasped, staggered, fell to one knee. "You cannot kill what feeds on death," Narks hissed, lifting him by the throat. "You are fuel, wood for the fire." Then, the deep rumbling. The trees had heard the fight, and they had answered. The chamber shook. Roots burst from the walls, not skein-forged, not corrupted, but pure, living bark, old bark, sacred. They slammed into Narks, coiling around his limbs, pinning him. He thrashed, screamed, bit, slashed, but they held. And from behind them, shapes emerged. Treekin, dryads, even spirits of trees long dead, ghostly, glowing, remembered. They had come for him. Venrillis pulled himself up. He walked slowly to the heartroot. He placed his palm against it. Whispered, "Remember who you are." The crystal pulsed. Once, then again. Then it screamed, not in pain, but in release. The roots tightened. Skitterfang howled as the forest crushed him. His body twisted, snapped, folded in on itself. The heartroot glowed gold, pure for one last moment. And then it consumed him. The warlock thing vanished in a bloom of golden flame and twisting bark. Venrillis collapsed to his knees. The forest fell silent. He had won. But the seed still pulsed in his veins, and the forest had tasted his rage. Chapter 21. Showdown in the Underroot. The heartroot chamber burned with a golden glow, but that light held no warmth. It was the kind of glow cast by divine judgment, final, fierce, and utterly indifferent. Skitterfang was gone, pulverized, absorbed into the roots he had desecrated. And yet the victory felt hollow. Venrillis knelt in the center of the chamber, soaked in blood and sap, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. The shard of corrupted seed pulsed faintly beneath his skin, its song now dull and slurred like a fever dream fading. The forest's power, once hot in his blood, now cooled, but didn't leave. It remained, waiting. Around him, the roots had settled. The crystalline veins that had once shimmered with skaven corruption now glowed with a subtle gold, pulsing slow, alive again. But something was wrong. The heartroot crystal wasn't just pulsing. It was growing. From the ground where Skitterfang had died, new roots pushed through the stone, thick and fast, not corrupted, not tainted, but not entirely natural either. They formed shapes, branches like arms, leaves like knives. A body forming. Venrillis staggered to his feet, and from the center of the new growth, something stood. It was tall, elven-shaped, bark-skinned, but not dryad, not treekin. It was him. Not a mirror, not a double, but a reflection of what he might become if he embraced the seed, accepted the power, surrendered to the pain. The creature opened eyes that glowed like twin moons. Venrillis drew his blades. "What are you?" The echo spoke with his voice, twisted, richer, resonant. "I am the forest vengeance. I am what you fed, what you awakened." Venrillis felt the root lines beneath his feet tremble. The air thickened with sap mist. His skin prickled. The power he had taken was answering this thing. "I killed Skittering," Benrilis said. "I broke the chain." "You became the chain," the echo hissed, stepping forward, bark creaking. "You used the seed. You drank from its root. Every kill you made, every Skaven you slaughtered, fed me." Benrilis circled, steps light despite the pain. "Then I'll starve you." The creature laughed. "You can't. You've already planted me." It charged. Fast. Too fast. Benrilis barely had time to parry. The first strike sent him sliding back across the root-crusted floor. The echo moved like liquid bark, blades forming from its arms, shifting between spear and sickle and whip. Each attack was unpredictable, fluid, impossible to anticipate. Benrilis countered with his own fury. He slashed, ducked, spun, his twin blades carving lines through the echo's bark flesh. Sap sprayed, thick and silver, steaming where it hit the ground. One slice opened the creature's thigh, another carved across its ribs. But it didn't slow. He grinned. "You fight yourself, Benrilis, and you always lose." It stabbed him, once, twice. A root blade pierced his thigh. Another slashed across his chest. Blood sprayed. He fell back, coughing, vision swimming. The echo stalked closer. "You could have been a god," it whispered. Benrilis dropped one blade, raised his hand. From the floor, the heart root pulsed. He screamed a word, not elvish, not druidic, but something older. A word the seed had whispered to him in the dark. The root lines obeyed. They surged upward, pure, glowing gold, unleashed. They wrapped the echo, entwined its limbs, drove into its bark. The creature shrieked, struggling. Its form cracked, splintered, bled sap that burned. "No," it howled. "I am the forest." Benrilis stood over it, blood pouring from his wounds. "No," he said. "You're what I feared. And I buried you." He plunged his last blade into its chest. The echo exploded in a bloom of golden leaves and white fire. The shockwave tore through the chamber, blowing back roots, shattering Skaven machinery, cracking stone. The heart root flashed, once, then settled into silence. Benrilis collapsed beside the remains. Just a stump now, a hollow shell. But his again. He was alone, alive, and still whole. But the forest had changed, and so had he. Chapter 22. Splintered Souls. Benrilis awoke to the sound of sap dripping. Slow, steady, like the ticking of a cracked timepiece. He lay on his back in the hollow of the heartroot chamber, surrounded by the shattered remnants of what he had slain, what he had been. The echo was gone, dissolved into memory and mist, but its imprint remained, in the walls, in the roots, in his bones. His breath rattled in his chest, shallow and wet. Each inhale brought pain, a reminder that victory had not come without cost. He rose slowly. Every joint burned. His thigh was slashed. His ribs ached. Blood had dried in the creases of his armor, turning black and flaky. But the worst pain was not physical. It throbbed in the soul, raw and unfinished. He walked to the center of the chamber, where the heartroot crystal now stood, silent. Its light had dulled to a faint gold, the green corruption finally purged. But it no longer pulsed, no longer sang. He reached out, touched it, and everything came flooding back. The screams of the dryads burned alive, the silence of the Waywatchers who never returned, Cowan's blood trailing into the dirt, the beastmen who fell laughing into fire, the Blightroots, the seed's eye. The echo's last breath. It hit him all at once, a deluge of grief and guilt. He staggered, gritting his teeth, fists clenched until knuckles cracked. But something else stirred in the roots. Not just memory, not just pain. Presence. From the wall of living bark, a shape emerged. A spirit. She was tall, formed of golden leaves and glowing root flesh. Her eyes were soft light, her limbs fragile as willow branches. A dryad, but not one of rage or vengeance, one of peace. She walked toward him without sound, each step barely disturbing the soil. Vendrilis dropped to his knees. "I failed," he whispered. She touched his brow. "No," she whispered back, not in sound, but in the language of root and rhythm. "You paid." He looked up at her. "I can still feel it," he said, voice raw. "The shard, the seed, it's in me." "Yes," she replied, "but it no longer grows." He bowed his head. "What happens now?" The spirit turned to the heartroot. "The forest sleeps." A pause. "And heals." But Vendrilis felt no healing. He rose slowly, pain gritting his teeth. Too much was lost. The spirit walked to the roots and knelt, pressing her hand to the soil. And the ground answered. From it rose shapes, flickering memories, glowing phantoms of the fallen. Twin, standing tall, his bow whole again, smiling faintly. Wine. Varela, her form aglow with new fire, arms open in welcome. Hrothgar, roaring silently, then bowing in recognition. And others, so many others, lost souls who had bled into the soil, whose names were now etched in bark and stone. "You carry them," the spirit whispered, "not as weight, as root." Benrinus closed his eyes. Let it in. The grief, the rage, the love, all of it. When he opened them again, the spirit was gone. The chamber was still. The war was over. But the scars would never fade. He turned to leave, each step heavier than the last, each breath a reminder of who he had become and what he had given. The heartroot glowed behind him, enduring, and within him something splintered. But not broken, never broken. Chapter 23. Ashes of Victory. The climb back to the surface took hours. Vendrilis emerged into the light of a dawn dulled by smoke and silence. The skies over Mirthwood were no longer black with warpfire, but neither were they clear. Ash hung in the air like dust in a forgotten library, soft, slow falling, persistent. Every breath tasted like endings. He stood atop the ruin of Hollowspire, where once the canopy had arched with pride. Now, trees sagged under their own grief. The war had ended, but it had taken with it the innocence of the forest. Roots were still smoldering, branches still bore scorch marks. The earth itself had been peeled back, shown its heart, and asked to survive it. Below him, the remnants of his war band gathered. A dozen dryads, singed and cracked, limbs wrapped in moss bandages. The surviving Waywatchers stood in formation, quiet and hollow-eyed. Hrothgar, still alive, barely, sat on a broken stone slab, cradling his wounded side with one hand and sharpening a blood-caked axe with the other. His horns were broken, his fur matted with dried sap and blood. They looked up at Vendrilis as he stepped forward. He didn't speak. Words had no place here. Instead, he reached into his cloak and withdrew the last seed, one of the few untainted, pulled from the grove long before the war had reached its fever pitch. It glowed softly, a pale green light that pulsed, like the heartbeat of something not yet born. He knelt and placed it in the scorched soil. No prayer, no chant, just silence. And the forest answered, The ground trembled, softly, like a child stirring from slumber. A root sprouted, thin and delicate, curling through the ash. A single leaf unfurled. Small, fragile, alive. A murmur rippled through those gathered. Some dryads wept, visibly, silently. One waywatcher fell to his knees, eyes fixed on the sprout. Even Grothka paused, his blade forgotten in one bloodied hand. Benrilli stood. It wasn't enough, but it was something. That night, they burned the dead. Not in pyres of vengeance, but in circles of remembrance. Each fire was small, fed with herbs and sacred sap, each flame releasing the scent of memory into the air. The spirits came, not in wrath, but in peace. Ghosts of warriors, of dryads, of beasts and friends. They danced in the firelight, flickering briefly before fading into root and mist. Kilwyn appeared last. He stood across the fire from Venrilis, whole and smiling faintly. Benrils didn't speak. Kilwyn raised a hand, and then he too faded. By morning, only ash remained, and peace. But it was not the peace of triumph. It was the peace of a battlefield after the crows have come, of silence after the last scream. The forest lived, but it was not the same. Venrilis walked alone into the heart of Mirthwood. Where once birds had sung, now the wind carried only whispers. He heard his name spoken by leaves, felt eyes in the trees. The forest knew him now, not just as protector, but as one of its weapons. He sat beneath an ancient tree, back resting against its cracked trunk, and closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he slept without dreams. But the roots remembered, and in their memory, something new began to stir. Chapter 24. Reap what was sown. Venrilis woke to the sound of roots shifting, not in alarm, but in awakening. The ancient tree he had slept beneath, the last of the elder oaks untouched by war, was changing. Its bark no longer wept. Its branches stretched upward, creaking like old bones stiff from slumber, and at its base, where Venrilis had planted the seed the day before, a small grove had begun to form. Leaves unfurled. Light filtered through the canopy in shafts of gold, not green. But this was no rebirth, but was transformation. The war had not ended Mirthwood, it had evolved it. Fenris stood slowly, muscles groaning in protest. He felt older than he had ever known, worn down by grief, etched with pain, but laced with something sharp beneath the weariness. Resolve. From the edge of the grove, a figure approached. Vaharel. She limped, her leg wrapped in lichen-soaked bandage, one eye milky from a Skaven curse that no spell could undo. Yet she moved with purpose, her steps were sure, her gaze steady. "They come again," she said without greeting. "Not Skaven, something worse." Venrilis frowned. What could be worse? She handed him a shard of bark, fresh, cracked with seared glyphs. Not machines, not beasts. At first he didn't understand. Then the implications hit like a blade to the gut. Men from the Empire. Or perhaps from further still. Rumors had always floated like mist beyond the forest's borders. Expeditions seeking lumber, artifacts, soil samples, ancient magic. But now, the forest was wounded. Vulnerable. Its defenses scattered. The blood had drawn them. What do they want? Venrilis asked, already knowing the answer. Harvest? Varela said. Like always? His fingers curled around the bark shard until it cracked. They'll find nothing but rot and ruin, he growled. No, she corrected, her voice cool and brittle. They'll find us. By the afternoon, the remnants of his warband had reconvened. They were not whole. Some had gone to heal in isolation, others had vanished into the wilds, never to be seen again. But those who remained understood what was at stake. They had fought against infestation. Now they would fight against greed. Scouts reported human wagons rolling through the eastern rim, engineers mapping terrain, sellswords with torch and axe walking in loose formation. There were no prayers, no druids, no respect, just calculation. One group had already found a grove and burned it. Venrilis reached it hours later. The dryads there had not fled. They had been nailed to trees, arms pinned by iron bolts, mouths stuffed with cloth to silence their screams. Their bark had been peeled in long strips, exposing the trembling flesh beneath. Venrilis said nothing. He stepped forward, and gently, mercifully ended the last one's life. Sap bled down his hands like wine. Behind him, Waywatchers prepared their arrows. Beastmen sniffed the air, low growls vibrating in their throats. Dryads, sharpened claws already blackened with memory. Venrilis turned, soaked in death, voice flat. No prisoners. The first assault was swift. A human outpost, a watchtower and supply caravan, burned before the sun fell. Arrows rained from the trees like a plague. Dryads tore men from their tents and dragged them screaming into the dark. Beastmen gored horses and stampeded through the fires, bleeding with bloodlust. Venrilis moved like a wraith among them. His blades whispered through bone and sinew. He found one of the engineers, a man scribbling notes even as the slaughter unfolded around him. The man begged in broken Eltaran, offering coin, offering knowledge. Venrilis slit his throat. War had carved the mercy from him. When the fires settled, they left nothing behind. No corpses, no wreckage, only silence, only warning. A single message, carved into the scorched bark of a tree. The forest remembers. It will not forgive again. As dawn broke, Venrilis stood on the ridge and watched a second human column approach, 3 times the size of the first. He knew they would not stop, but neither would he. The roots were no longer healing. They were hardening, preparing for another war. One, not of corruption, but of dominion. And Venrilis was ready. Chapter 25. The Last Thorn. Dawn broke, but no bird sang. The forest stood silent, poised not in peace but in anticipation. Like a hunter just before the spring, like the slow draw of a bowstring held taut against the cheekbone of time. Mirthwood, once a cradle of life, now resembled something older, something crueler, primordial. Venrilis stood at the edge of the ridge, staring down into the mist-choked valley where the human column moved, slow and purposeful. Dozens of wagons rolled forward, wheels creaking under stacks of saws, oil casks, and spellbinders' glyphstones. War priests marched beside mercenaries in gleaming steel. Banners flew bearing the black sun of a minor baron's expedition. They saw only lumber, only soil, only spoil. He saw something else. He saw desecration. Behind him, his warband stood ready. Not an army, no, that had died with the Skaven War, but something sharper. Beastmen, clad in thorn mail and bone, dryads whose limbs bore scorched scars like armor, waywatchers with soul coral fletching made from the feathers of their own fallen kin. Varela approached from his left, her eyes now permanently glazed by root light. She no longer spoke in words, just emotion, pulsed directly into the root lines, into the marrow of the forest. When she placed her hand on Venrilis' shoulder, he felt it. This is the last war. He nodded once. Then he lifted his hand. The ambush began with silence. Then, Roots rose like spears from the ground, skewering the first line of human scouts. Their screams were short. Arrows whistled from the trees, embedding into throats and eyes. Flames erupted from the wagons as dryads poured fire oil into the supply carts and ignited them with bark fingers slicked in warpfire remnants. Men shouted. Steel clashed. Horses bucked and fled, trampling their own. Then the beast men hit. Grothka, flanked by the last of his warbrood, tore into the left flank like a plague. His mouth was smeared with blood, his horns broken but bound with vine iron. He gutted a priest with his bare hands, then used the man's staff to impale another through the chest. Then Relis moved like a ghost among fury. His blades, now part of him, fused at the grip with rootbone, flashed silver and black. One slash gutted a war mage mid-chant, another pierced the heart of a sword captain mid-command. He moved from shadow to slaughter, never resting, never hesitating. He cut down one soldier begging for mercy. Another tried to flee. Venrilis caught him with a thrown blade to the spine. No prisoners. Not this time. They reached the heart of the convoy, where the Baron himself stood, armored in dwarven plate and clutching a rune blade etched with holy symbols. He raised it high, calling on his gods. Venrilis answered by lunging forward and ramming his dagger into the man's thigh, dragging him down into the mud. They wrestled, snarling, blade against blade. The Baron swung hard, slicing into Venrilis' shoulder. Blood sprayed. The elf screamed, but he did not fall. Instead, he drove his forehead into the Baron's nose, shattering it. The man reeled, and Venrilis seized the moment, driving his twin blades beneath the plate, into the ribs and upward. The Baron choked on his own blood. Venrilis whispered into his ear, voice like the roots, cold and final. "This was your warning." Then he pulled the blades free, and the body dropped like felled timber. The remaining humans broke. They fled into the trees, and the trees closed. Vaherla called the roots, the forest swallowed the runners. Arrows followed, screams faded into silence. It was done. Venrilis stood in the wreckage of the convoy, rain beginning to fall, soft and steady. The war was over. Not the first, not the last, but the one that changed everything. Behind him, the heartroot pulsed again, not corrupted, not golden, but something new. A fusion. A memory of rage and purpose, a seed that remembered both love and fire. The forest would heal, but it would never again be innocent. Venrilis turned, blood dripping from his fingertips, eyes dim but unbroken. He was no longer a guardian. He was the forest's wrath. And in Mirtwood, no axe would ever rise unchallenged again.